Compared to the previous nations we've encountered in Tevat, Fontaine's government structure seems to bear most similarity to institutions which are present in real life. Not that the other nations are extremely unrealistic, but they follow unusual processes of choosing leaders. With Mondstadt and Liyue, it seems like there is an application procedure and appointment mechanisms for successors. With Inazuma, you have political clans leading, and with Sumeru, the university is the government itself, with prominent alumni running the show. Meanwhile, Fontaine runs on the judicial system, and although no country in the real world has the judicial branch as necessarily the most powerful arm of the government, at least the way it works seems more familiar to us, especially if you like following courtroom dramas or even news coverage of popular trials. Of course, we can expect lots of things to be different in Fontaine's court system compared to real life cause duh, it's a fantasy, but still it would benefit us to think about how our real life law might be similar and different to that of Fontaine's, for us to understand what they're doing wrong, or more interestingly, what we're doing wrong in real life, since I think the entire Fontaine arc is probably a commentary on that. So with that, I welcome you to this video where I try to provide some food for thought for things to consider when it comes to Fontaine's speculations. Heavy disclaimer though, I'm far from being a lawyer, as I'm only a college student, so please feel free to correct some notions if ever. But before that, if you think you find these kinds of content interesting, why not go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to this channel to catch more of my future videos. And also, I would like to invoke a trigger warning for mentions of SA, death penalty, drugs, and the like. Feel free to click off this video if those make you uncomfortable. Basically, if you think about the process of trials, you'd imagine there are two sides fighting it out over a dispute, with the most popular kind being trying to identify people who are guilty of certain crimes and giving them the appropriate punishment. To facilitate this process, you have two lawyers fighting it out using evidence and measures stated in the law as a basis. Even if it is obvious that the suspect committed the crime, this process is still worth going through to completely eliminate all doubt about the facts of the situation and possibly calibrate the degree of sentencing for either the judge or the jury or the oratrice to decide on. More on that later. But essentially, yes, you need representatives of these two sides, commonly the prosecution and the defense, when it comes to criminal proceedings, although for civil cases there's no prosecution really. So we all know that, but assuming that Fontaine even does have two lawyers beating each other up with words and not just random people testifying for the judge without being summoned by either side, the first question that would come up here is, does Fontaine even have a prosecutor's office? Because if they have one, that means that the state itself can press charges and you have an entire group of people who are determined to find suspects guilty as part of their job. However, if Fontaine doesn't have such an office, then it is up to individual lawyers to file charges, and it almost feels like the state exaggerates its level of impartiality or something. On the flip side of this, it's also important to consider whether the Fontaine government appoints attorneys to help defendants who don't have access to one, because as I will explain in a future section on human rights, this is something every accused person is entitled to, so if Fontaine doesn't have this system, it could point towards their disregard for this right. So moving on from the people involved in court proceedings, and don't worry, I'll discuss the role of the judge later. We also have to consider what kinds of courts are there in Fontaine. Right now, it seems like there is just one centralized court which holds its proceedings in the upper epiclese, which could work since the population of Fontaine might be small, but also involves some troubling implications if ever that's true. Usually in real life, many countries have lower courts and then the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court at the very least. This means that if you feel like your trial was misjudged, then you can file an appeal at the Court of Appeals, well, if they consider your reasons valid, of course. Then even on to the Supreme Court if even the Court of Appeals has failed you. What this does is it allows for further recourses to be taken to correct injustices and even refine interpretations of certain laws in the face of contentious cases. So if Fontaine doesn't have those tiers to their court system, all decisions in the first trial alone are considered final without corrective mechanisms for injustices. Also, that would kinda imply that practically all cases are tried by the Chief Justice instead of them handling only the most important highest appealed cases. So that's something we ought to look out for. It's also worth contemplating how it's even possible for the judicial system to be the main branch of government because, with Fontaine seemingly being a reflection of late 18th century to early 20th century Western Europe, you would think that they would apply some political ideas from the philosophical era known as the Enlightenment. Montesquieu, a prominent philosopher from this time period, asserted that there should be a separation of powers into three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial, to promote liberty through the independent actions of these bodies. Of course, it's a very simple in theory, but in real life, such as in my own country, the Philippines, the executive branch can be quite dominant because the members from the other branches are likely to, pardon my language, kiss their asses. In some other countries, like the US, I think, but I'm not completely sure about this, the legislative branch can be quite powerful with how much they can either make a president's plans come true or bar them from ever being realized. However, I don't think I've seen real-life examples of the judicial branch dominating, considering judges are confined to, judging, and don't create new laws or policies, and also don't handle too much of the national budget. It's worth noting that judges in real life don't really run for their positions, so they don't seem that politically powerful, withholding the nation's approval as well. They're just chilling there. But with Fontaine, it could be that the judicial branch is the most prominent, but it could also oddly be that the judicial branch is the only branch, with the Chief Justice as the president almost, which must be so weird to think about. But I mean, it's Genshin. What's weird shouldn't be outside of our expectations. Still, I wonder how that would even work at all, because if there's no legislative branch, then does the same institution create the laws and also judge based on them? Doesn't that make the legal system kinda arbitrary now, since you as a judge can just scrap previous laws and make new ones? Well, I highly think this is unlikely, so I hope that Fontaine does show us that there's at least some kind of legislative branch that exists somehow, and if the executive and judicial branches are merged under the Chief Justice, hopefully there will at least be other agencies in the executive branch that would perform separate functions from the court officials. Additionally, I also think that it would be greatly beneficial for Fontaine to have a constitution, as it would provide the foundation for all subsequent laws and even legal interpretations to be upheld, and would serve as a reminder for what the nation stands for, to ensure that all laws they have would align with the nation's values rather than go against them. Plus, then we'd get to have someone yell, "That's unconstitutional!" in court. It's not like Fontaine will collapse though if they don't have one, but it just means that their laws might have greater tendencies of being contradictory or going against the country's true ideals. With these legal processes that I've mentioned previously, we can only speculate as to how similar or different they will be from what we have in real life. But one thing we are sure about, which is very, very different, is the idea of holding trials in an opera house for the purpose of entertainment and perhaps even catharsis. I think we can expect Fontaine's story arc to discuss the pitfalls of this, such as witnesses being made to testify differently based on being watched, or even people who might be afraid of filing cases due to the fear of having to testify in front of hundreds or even thousands of individuals, especially when it comes to sensitive personal experiences like SA, among others. It also makes me wonder if literally all cases are held in the opera house, because I mean, why would you do that for civil cases? It's like forcing the public to watch a documentary on accounting or something. Plus, cases in real life don't just happen to be in one day. So I don't know if in Fontaine the opera house would advertise it like, "The People of Fontaine versus the Traveler, a 3-part saga." Or will the court actually attempt to compress trials into one evening? Either way, if we're speculating about story tropes, the fact that the Akasha system was abolished in Sumeru means that it's possible for the Opera House trial system to be abolished in Fontaine as well. We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to reserve a separate discussion for the Chief Justice themselves. Not only because they have captured my heart and soul to the point of me worshipping them, but also there is something really odd about their job title which I hope to dive into. Okay, so being a Chief Justice implies the existence of Associate Justices within the Supreme Court. But Chief Justice Neuvillette seems to be sitting alone at almost every trial, making it seem like the Supreme Court has no other justices unless they preside over cases individually but do still run the Supreme Court together. But it's still weird. Perhaps the Chief in this case implies that there are other lower court judges, but the Chief Justice handles the most important cases. So basically, he's not really the Chief Justice, but just the most important judge. And while those are similar, it has different implications because that points to the absence of a Supreme Court where each member votes. And as much as I am very much enamored with Chief Justice Neuvillette, this streamlining of power is very, very, very problematic because instead of having a Supreme Court led by justices with diverse opinions and backgrounds, you have one guy running the whole show, and that can lead to abuses of power. However, based on my impression of him so far, which I will talk about in my next video, he seems to be very impartial and tries as hard as possible to be fair and treats justice as solemn. And in real life, even Supreme Courts with many members can still make stupid decisions like how in my country, they allowed our former dictator's body to be buried in their hero's burial for technicality reasons, and the US Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. So, oddly enough, there is a possibility that Chief Justice Neuvillette, although having all the power, can uphold the law better than Supreme Courts with many justices. But that idea is too reliant on the personality of one individual to define your entire nation's politics, basically. So, it's still very, very problematic inherently, no matter how good Fontaine's iudex is. I'm not saying that they should create a Supreme Court with many justices after Fontaine or Conquest, because it might not be necessary for them, but I just wanted to say that to remind you guys that the streamlining of power in real life is a huge red flag. Don't allow any head of state to attempt to rule for like more than 10 years, no matter how good they may seem, because that's just a sign of being into power grabbing. Not saying though that the iudex of Fontaine is power hungry. Their powers being streamlined are likely not due to their own prerogative, but a result of Fontaine's system being simply like that from the very beginning, and they might not have the ability to change the structure of legal institutions. With this, I'm really curious as to how they even got their position in the first place. Like, did Furina appoint them? Do they have a specific term of service only? Are they meant to be the Chief Justice indefinitely, which again is a systemic red flag? I wonder what their legal credentials are in terms of their track record with the bar exam and how they've climbed up the ladder from the lower court. Either that or they were granted the position automatically for some other reason, especially since people have been theorizing that Chief Justice Neuvillette is from an immortal race. Another important thing to think about is how much sentencing power does the judge really have? I doubt that Fontaine implements the jury system since it doesn't seem to be present in the trailer or the live stream, but Linnae mentions this thing called an oratrice that can give sentences accurately, and so now I wonder, does the oratrice deliver the final sentence with the iudex simply overseeing trials, or does this oratrice just predict sentences rather than necessarily finalizing them? Either way, it could potentially compromise the integrity of the iudex, so it's important for them to keep watch of this. Anyway, so what's the point of this segment? Basically, it's that the power dynamics of Fontaine can be potentially dangerous, so now we really have to rely on the moral character of Chief Justice Neuvillette to strike a balance between wielding this power and being a champion of fairness. Another thing I want to discuss about Fontaine's laws would be something that I think is a function of the law that's commonly ignored by people, which is the human rights protection aspect of it. Usually, the justice system is thought of as punitive because it seeks to make people face the consequences of their actions if they break the law. But there are also measures within the system that are supposed to be in place to protect each individual who goes through the legal process. As I mentioned earlier, lots of countries grant defendants the right to a legal counsel to give them a chance to defend themselves, which provides a safeguard from scapegoating and allows all sides to invoke the law to their benefit. There are also provisions in the law that nullify evidence that was obtained from coercion or violence in order to prevent torture from being used as mechanisms to make suspects confess, maybe even if they're not the actual perpetrators of the crime. You also have the option to what is colloquially known as pleading the fifth, or not answering questions in trial, which can end up incriminating you. Interestingly, I wonder if fewer people in Fontaine choose to plead the fifth, considering rumors might be spread about them by the audience of their trials if they keep their mouths shut. So even if Fontaine has this legal provision, the circumstances might prevent them from taking it. And then there are also things like the writ of habeas corpus, which is commonly invoked by detainees or their families to ask prison officials to bring this detainee to the court to let them know the reason why they've been detained, to prevent law enforcement from throwing anyone into jail even for shallow reasons. And on top of all of these, the presumption of innocence seems to exist in Fontaine, as implied by the end of Alice's story about the little Melusine in the 3.8 version livestream, where she mentions that the court is careful to not accuse an innocent person. I don't know. It's a good assumption to make in legal proceedings most of the time, so that it ensures that proof is fully utilized to declare the person as guilty rather than just relying on biases. I think Fontaine does have some degree of human rights protection in their laws, considering how in the 4.0 trailer, Chief Justice Nouvelette advises someone to seek the protection of the guards, likely invoking something like maybe witness protection or even possibly giving a suspect the opportunity to clear their name and avoid being attacked by the public in the process. At least that's how I interpret it, but we've yet to find out until the Archon quest drops. If in case Fontaine has very few protective measures in their law, making it way too punitive without giving defendants a chance to defend themselves, then it means Fontaine is screwed, and they ought to change how they carry out the legal proceedings and create a Bill of Rights if necessary. As a footnote, if the death penalty is a thing in Fontaine, I hope they abolish it because it goes too far in violating criminals' right to life, and it becomes a horrific consequence for defendants who are found guilty even if they were only framed or scapegoated. I find it really inhumane, and I hope both Fontaine and our real-life governments will avoid this form of punishment. Speaking of legal proceedings, I know that Fontaine's judicial system is currently being framed as very flawed, but I think what's even worse than that would be citizens resorting to extrajudicial means to exact justice. Vigilantism, basically. Vigilantism is usually carried out when a person harms others due to the belief that they are criminals or evil people. While it can stem from good motivations, it is a direct attack on the people's human rights, and they have no way of defending themselves using the law. This is just a very touchy subject for me because in my country, lots of extrajudicial killings of suspected drug users or sellers occurred, and that's a very clear example of why extrajudicial resorts are bad, because if these suspects had been tried properly, then they would have gone to jail, which would allow them to reflect on their actions and hopefully find ways to improve themselves in order to avoid getting detained again, and their families can still visit them every now and then and await their release a few years down the line. But because of extrajudicial killings, they did not even get the chance for potential rehabilitation and just died because some random person thought that was the right thing to do. It's horrific, and people who commit these crimes are the exact opposite of being heroes. Going back to Fontaine, I wonder if there will be an exploration of extrajudicial courses of action from citizens who are frustrated with the justice system. On one hand, maybe this will happen less because watching defendants be charged as guilty in opera trials will be satisfying enough to remove some level of aggression, but these opera trials can also exacerbate the problem by prompting pea-brained audience members to attempt to end this dramatic play in their own way, especially if they have a god complex or whatever. Regardless, I hope Fontaine's laws discourage these kinds of actions and find ways to rightfully penalize those who engage in these acts instead of condoning vigilantism like some real-life governments have. I know this may seem like I have lots of expectations for Fontaine to be like our real-life justice system or better, but I doubt that even the Archon Quest's aftermath will push the nation's justice system into becoming perfect, because that's impossible. What I'm simply doing is pointing out what dynamics of the law we can look out for when we play the Archon Quest and how we can use Fontaine's storylines to spark discussions on real-life justice systems despite some obvious differences between the fictional and real world. For example, while we don't hold trials in opera houses in real life, Fontaine's premise of doing this is likely supposed to be a commentary on how justice can feel performative in real life and how we should critique this manner of carrying it out. I hope that despite Genshin providing an avenue for us to escape from our real-life problems, that Fontaine's arc will still somehow invite us to be more socially aware so that we can critique and find solutions to the ills facing the justice system in real life. Even if we don't become lawyers or government officials in the future, maybe we can help our family members and acquaintances seek legal assistance or donate to nonprofits that provide legal services. Regardless, I hope we get to see a compelling arc in our new awaited region, while also striving to apply our learnings from the future Archon Quest to real life if possible. But no pressure though. With all that babbling, I'm going to end here, but if you made it to the end, I really appreciate it, and I hope you can support this channel by subscribing to me if you appreciated the discussion points I mentioned throughout this video, and I hope to sustain this kind of content creation as well. If you're interested in that, please stay tuned to my next videos, and you can also reach out to me through Twitter if you want to have more extensive conversations. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.